So our guest speaker, who's going to come up here in a moment, is a very dear friend of mine. I met her only a couple of years ago, and we met at a CAPS event, and I think it was actually, it was an NSA event, which is the U.S. speaking association in the United States. And we just said hello and had dinner together, and that was it. Since then, we have traveled around the world together. So at many of these conferences that we have attended and the summits, Susan has been with us. So we got to know her really well when we were in South Africa a couple of years ago. And then we were in New Zealand with her. And so much so that Susan and I are now the co-chairs for the CAPS convention in Vancouver in December this year. She is an amazing lady who has had a career that has been very diverse, from Alaska to Hawaii to Texas to Canada. Those are just the places she lived. But she has spoken all over the world. So I encourage you, after you hear her speak, to find her and just talk to her about some of her amazing experiences that she's had all over this amazing world that we have. So without further ado, I would like you all to stand up and help give an amazing, warm Ottawa welcome to Susan Luke Evans.
She didn't take a turn. She never took a turn. Every person, every child in that 9-year-old Sunday school classroom knew Dorothy never took a turn. You see, Dorothy had polio. She had steel braces on her legs. She walked with crutches. It was a real challenge for Dorothy to get from point A to point B. But this year, this Sunday, there was a new teacher, Mrs. Adams. And Mrs. Adams didn't understand or know about Dorothy. The custom was that each Sunday, a different child would be chosen to take the records for that particular class to the church office. And so when it was time to choose the child, Mrs. Adams said, "It's your turn." I don't take a turn. And every child in the room said, "She doesn't take a turn? She never takes a turn." And Mrs. Adams looked at her and said, "But you can, can't you?" Her eyes got really big. And she gulped several times. And then she said, I could try. And with her braces clanking and her crutches thumping and a smile as big as all outdoors on her face, she went down that hall to the church office. You see, the story that Mrs. Adams lived was a story about asking simple questions and expecting a positive answer. And that's the legacy that she passed on to Dorothy. Because in that moment, when Mrs. Adams said, "But you can, can't you?" Dorothy began to think of all the other things that might be possible for her. Things that she'd never dreamed she could do. And one of those became a goal: to get rid of those braces, get rid of those crutches, to go to university when she grew up and have a career. And sure enough, that's what she did. As part of the application process to go to university, she went to the doctor for a physical. Had the physical, the doctor came in, said, "Don't go to university." "Why not?" she said. In her ear, in her brain, thinking, "But I can, can't I?" Because that was what Mrs. Adams taught her. And he said, "You should go to vocational school or business school, get a job where you can sit down. Because I've known you all your life. You were born with one leg shorter than the other. You have a slightly deformed foot. You had polio as a child. There's not been a day in your life without pain. Get a job where you can sit down. Because in 3 years, you will be in a wheelchair for the rest of your life." She went to university. She graduated in 4 years with honors, thank you very much. She got her first job, began her career working with young people in California, and part of her job was to conduct camps in the summer in the mountains. Still had one leg shorter than the other, still had a slightly deformed foot, still had some pain. But Dorothy managed to always do whatever the job took because she could. Dorothy then married a widower with 4, count them 4, teenage children because she could. A few years later, against all physical odds, they had a baby. And a few years after that, they adopted yet another child. You see, Dorothy passed that legacy from Mrs. Adams on to all those kids. I was the baby. I was the only child, the only biological child. So I had all these siblings, but I was the only one. And I was told my entire life, you can do whatever you want. And so I, too, went to university and had a career. Now, my first career, Jane mentioned it. I was a school teacher. I was 22 years old. I was going to save the world in Alaska. Not only was it Alaska, it was remote Native American villages where no TV, no telephone, no running water, all that stuff. The first year, I taught in a school of 500 people that lived in that village if you counted every sled dog. There were a few. My job was to teach grades 7 through 12 English to students that their first language was not English, and they had no clue about traditional English literature. Well, I was smart enough to know that for those kids to be successful, I had to do something different. So the school had lots of resources. Video, we didn't have TV, we didn't have internet, that was back in the day. But we had videos, we had tapes, tapes. Yeah, some of you know. Tapes. And the rest of you were saying, what? What did she say? We had videos, we had tapes, they could write stories, they could do all these things, and I put them on a point system. And every activity that they did was worth X number of points. And the only caveat was, you do as many as you want, and what I said to them is, everybody should be able to get an A or a B. Because you'll know where you are at any point in time, and if you don't have enough points, do some extra credit, get some more points. This is not rocket science. And they believed me. Who knew? And so, at the end of the first grading period, every one of my students got an A or a B. I was thrilled. They were ecstatic. They'd never gotten anything close to that in any English class they'd ever taken. everybody was excited. Everybody was happy. There was just one exception. The science teacher taught 2 doors down came storming into my classroom. "What do you mean giving these kids A's and B's?" I said, with all the authority and idealism of a 22-year-old, "I did not give them to them. They earned them." He was not impressed. He said, "They're not capable. They're not smart enough." "Excuse me, you want to see my grade book?" "No." "Haven't you looked at their IQ scores?" "No." "Well, if you'd bothered to look at their IQ scores, you would know that they're not capable of getting A's and B's, and probably very few C's." And I said, "Excuse me, I don't mean to be rude." Some people in this room know I am. But I said, "You know, those IQ tests were developed in Middle America for Middle Americans. They were not developed for students north of the Arctic Circle who lived in a village." And I said, "And if you'll recall, part of that test is to match pictures. So when you see a picture of a tire in Middle America and you have an opportunity to match it with a car or a train or a boat, you match it with the car." But we didn't have any cars. We didn't have any roads. We didn't have any of that stuff. And so north of the Arctic Circle, in a fishing village, they matched the tire with the boat because they were on the outsides of the boat so they wouldn't get all banged up when they came to the dock. But then they sent those tests back to Middle America and they graded them, and oh, surprise, they were wrong. I said, "I don't pay attention to something that's not based on the experience base of these kids. That's not fair." He was still not impressed. He huffed and he puffed and he left, and we went on. Here's the thing. At 22, I was not the world's best teacher. My colleague, who had been in that village for 15 years, was not the worst teacher on the planet. And the kids didn't get smarter or dumber going up and down the hall from one classroom to another. The difference was in our expectations of those students, that we communicated both verbally and non-verbally. I expected them to do well because Mrs. Adams told my mom, and my mom told me, and the legacy lived on. He didn't have those same kinds of expectations. So fast forward to Mom, age 96, and she finally got her wheelchair. Guess what color it was? Red. Because she wanted a red one back in the 30s. So I called her that day and I said, "How is it? But tell me all about the wheelchair." "Oh," she said, "it's red and it's electric." And I said, "Oh dear." And she said, "You know, the nice young man that brought it, he showed me how to steer it and all that." And she said, "Did you know that you can set these things to go so many miles an hour?" And I thought, oh. I said, "And?" And she said, "And the nice young man had set it to 4 miles an hour." And I revved it up to 10, she said. She was known as Speedy at the retirement facility, and I personally have seen people with walkers jump out of her way. She did it. Why? Because Mrs. Adams said, but you can, can't you? What a legacy Mrs. Adams left because she believed that people could do well. You see, the stories that we live every day allow us to touch other people's lives. And when we do, our legacy is built. And it moves forward through them a little bit differently. Maybe it gets massaged. So my challenge to all of us here today is to let's rev those stories up to 10. Because we can. Can't we? Thank you.